The evening air in Applegate, Oregon, was thick with the scent of pine, the kind of evening that promised a storm. It was the kind of night when families are supposed to gather. But for the Moore family, there was only distance, bitterness, and a sense of impending disaster. Shane Patrick Moore, 63, drove his truck up the long gravel driveway to his mother's house, the truck's engine growling, as though it too was preparing for a confrontation. Inside, his sister Kelly was already there, pacing, her face a mask of anger. She had been trying to avoid this moment for weeks now. The last time she saw Shane, things hadn't ended well. He had thrown a bottle of motor oil through the window of her car, the glass shattering as her daughter, Aisling, watched from the doorway. Aisling, just 26 years old, had seen her mother in pain, and the memory of that violent outburst haunted her every night. The family was on the edge. Shane had been relentless in his attempts to force his mother, Lori Moore, to sign a new will, one that would drastically change the distribution of her assets upon her death. It was a power struggle, a game of money and control. Shane wanted to ensure that if Lori passed, he would have his fair share, even if it meant alienating everyone around him. Aisling had grown up in this house, surrounded by the tension of her mother's broken relationship with her brother. For Aisling, the house had always felt like a prison. Every corner, every room, seemed to echo with the ghost of family conflict. But tonight was different. Tonight, something would break. Aisling stood by the window, watching as Shane's truck stopped outside. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of dread and a strange sense of inevitability. She had known for years that Shane was dangerous. His anger could ignite without warning, and when it did, nothing could stop it. As Shane entered the house, his voice was the first thing to fill the air, loud, demanding. "Lori, you need to sign it. Now, or things are going to get ugly." Lori, who was sitting quietly at the kitchen table, looked up at her son, her eyes tired. She had already signed papers once, and she knew Shane wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Kelly stood, her body stiff, but she didn't speak. Aisling was still standing by the window, her eyes never leaving the scene unfolding in the living room. But then, as Shane stormed further into the house, things went from bad to worse. "Shane, just leave it. We don't need to do this." Kelly finally spoke, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. Shane whirled on her, his face contorted with rage. "You don't tell me what to do, Kelly. I'm in charge here." It was at that moment that Aisling knew the situation was beyond her control. The sound of her own heartbeat seemed to drown out everything else. In that instant, her mind flashed back to the time when Shane had thrown the motor oil at Kelly's car. Her mother had been devastated, and Aisling had been terrified. This time, the situation felt even worse. Shane wasn't just angry, he was dangerous. Aisling moved quietly towards the kitchen, her mind racing. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a gun. It was something she had never used before, but in her hands, it felt like a lifeline, a promise that she could protect her mother from the storm that Shane was about to unleash. She didn't hesitate. The gun was in her hand, the cold steel pressing against her palm as she stepped into the living room. Her pulse raced, her fingers trembling. "Shane, stop!" she called out, her voice steady, but the words felt foreign in her mouth. "You need to leave. Now." Shane didn't even glance at her. His focus was solely on Kelly. "I'm not going anywhere until she signs it," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. But Aisling knew what was coming. She had seen it in his eyes, felt it in the air around them. He wasn't just threatening anymore. He was ready to strike. Without thinking, without understanding the full consequences of what she was doing, Aisling raised a gun. The shot echoed through the house, louder than anything Aisling had ever heard. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Shane's body jerked, and he collapsed to the ground. Everything went silent after that. Aisling stood frozen, the gun still in her hand, her heart racing her chest. But her mind couldn't catch up with the horror she had just caused. Kelly screamed, running to Shane's side, but it was too late. He was gone. Aisling dropped the gun, her legs giving way beneath her as the weight of what she had done crashed over her. She had killed her uncle. She had killed her own family. The silence that followed was suffocating. As the minutes passed, Aisling stood in a daze. Her mind could barely process what had just happened. The gunshot had been a reflex, a desperate attempt to stop her uncle's rage. But now, standing over Shane's lifeless body, she wasn't sure if she'd save her family or destroyed it completely. Her mother, Kelly, was beside herself. She was frantic, crying out, but Aisling couldn't move. Her hands shook as she watched Kelly dial the phone, calling 911. The operator's voice on the other end sounded distant, almost too calm for the situation unfolding in front of her. "I need help," Kelly screamed. "My brother's been shot. He's dead." Aisling could barely hear the operator's questions. The words seemed to float above her, meaningless. All she could focus on was the sight of Shane lying on the floor, blood pooling around him. The operator tried to calm Kelly down, asking for details, but Kelly's voice was hysterical, and Aisling couldn't bring herself to speak. She was paralyzed by the enormity of what had just happened. The minutes dragged on as they waited for the authorities to arrive. Aisling could hear the sirens in the distance, getting closer, but still, she couldn't move. The reality of the situation was too much for her to bear. When the police arrived, Aisling was still standing by the doorway, her gaze fixed on the floor. Her mother was trying to explain what had happened, but her words were frantic, jumbled. Aisling's eyes flicked to the officers as they entered the room, their eyes scanning the scene. One of the officers looked at her, his face unreadable. "Did you shoot him?" he asked. Aisling nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I had to. He was going to hurt my mom." The officer didn't respond immediately. He glanced at the gun on the floor, then back at Aisling. The evidence was clear. Shane was dead, and Aisling had been the one to pull the trigger. But something fell off. Kelly's frantic behavior didn't add up. Aisling had always known her mother to be strong, but now her desperation seemed almost too much. Aisling couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story than just a simple act of self-defense. As the police took Aisling into custody, her mind raced. Could she really have done the right thing? Was it self-defense? Or had she just given in to the chaos that had defined her family for so long? The next days would bring answers, but at that moment, Aisling didn't have the clarity she needed. All she had was the haunting image of Shane's lifeless body and the weight of a decision that would change everything. The following morning, Aisling found herself sitting in a small interrogation room at the Applegate police station. The cold metal of the chair beneath her seemed to amplify the chill creeping down her spine. She hadn't slept. How could she? The image of Shane's blood, pooling around him, was burned into her memory. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see his face twisted in pain, his eyes wide with shock, as though he couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. The door opened, and a detective entered the room. He was middle-aged, with graying hair and a look of quiet authority. He sat across from Aisling, a small notebook in front of him. "Good morning, Miss Moore," he said, his voice measured but kind. "How are you feeling?" Aisling didn't answer at first. The question seemed so trivial in the face of everything that had happened. Instead, she stared at the detective, as though hoping that his words would somehow make sense of the chaos inside her head. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't true, but she couldn't bring herself to admit just how shattered she was. The detective nodded, and then slid a file across the table towards her. "I'm sure this is difficult, but I need you to tell me everything that happened. From the moment Shane walked in until we got there." Aisling took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the file. She hadn't told anyone what had happened from her perspective, not in full. But now, the truth was inescapable. She couldn't avoid it anymore. I didn't mean to kill him," she began, her voice cracking. "It was supposed to be a warning. I just wanted him to stop. He was so angry at my mom, at all of us. He wouldn't listen." The detective scribbled something down in his notebook, but didn't interrupt her. He just let her speak. I remember him shouting at her again. He kept demanding she sign those papers. He said we'd all regret it if she didn't. And then Kelly, my mom, was trying to calm him down, but it wasn't working. He just kept getting angrier. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed the gun from the drawer. I didn't even think about it. I didn't think I'd actually shoot him. Aisling paused, her breath shaky as she wiped her eyes. The guilt was overwhelming. She had been terrified of Shane, terrified of what he would do next. But had she really been in danger? Had she been pushed to the edge of self-defense? Or had her fear simply overwhelmed her? The detective looked at her with sharp gaze, as if trying to read between the lines of her confession. "So, you pulled a gun on him. What happened next?" "I told him to stop. I told him to leave." "But he didn't listen," Aisling whispered, her voice barely audible now. "He kept yelling. He kept moving toward Kelly. And I didn't know what to do. I couldn't let him hurt her." The words hung in the air. Aisling's heart beat faster as she recalled that moment. The moment where she made the choice that would haunt her forever. The detective nodded, his expression unchanged. "You shot him in the chest." "Correct." Aisling nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The memory of the shot, the way it echoed in her ears, the way Shane collapsed without a sound, was too much for her to bear. The detective leaned back in his chair, studying her closely. "Do you understand why we need to investigate further, Aisling? This is a homicide. There's no getting around that. Your uncle is dead, and you're the one who pulled the trigger." Aisling felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. She had killed her uncle, but there were so many questions that still lingered, questions she didn't have the answers to. Was it truly self-defense? Or had she acted out of anger, fear, or something more? I didn't mean to kill him," she repeated, as though saying the words would somehow make them true. "I just wanted him to stop. I didn't know what else to do." The detective's voice softened, but his gaze never wavered. "You've told us your version of events, Aisling, but we still need to figure out if your actions were justified. Was there a real threat to you or your mother? Was there a way to de-escalate the situation? We need to understand everything." Aisling felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She wanted to scream, to tell him it had been an accident, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized there were things she hadn't said. What had really happened before she shot Shane? What had Kelly been doing all this time? And most importantly, why had Shane been so angry in the first place? The police investigation into Shane's death unfolded slowly over the next few days. Aisling's life, once chaotic but predictable in its dysfunction, had now been turned upside down. Every conversation, every glance from her mother, felt like a silent judgment. But there was a deeper layer to this tragedy, one that Aisling hadn't fully realized yet. Kelly, her mother, had been far too quick to label the situation as self-defense. As the authorities dug deeper, however, strange inconsistencies began to surface. Investigators discovered that Shane had been involved in a bitter dispute with Kelly and Lori, not just over the will, but also over hidden family debts. In fact, it was Shane who had been financially responsible for keeping the family afloat after their father's death. But instead of gratitude, Shane's family felt resentment and a growing sense of entitlement. His motives, investigators concluded, weren't as simple as greed. There was something more complicated at play. What Aisling had not realized, however, was that her mother, Kelly, had been the one to have the most to gain from Shane's death. Kelly had been conspicuously absent during Shane's final moments, not trying to stop the altercation, but instead sitting quietly, watching from the sidelines. Why hadn't she intervened? Why hadn't she stopped the situation before it escalated? It became clear that Kelly had been hiding something she hadn't shared with Aisling. As the investigators dug deeper into Kelly's background, they found that she had been involved in a number of questionable financial dealings, including a suspicious life insurance policy that named her as the sole beneficiary. Shane had been pushing for the new will to be signed, not because of some long-held grudge, but because he suspected something was wrong with his mother's actions. But there was more. As the investigation continued, Aisling began to uncover the truth. Her mother's role in this wasn't as simple as she'd been led to believe. There were whispers of hidden debts, fraudulent loans, and a complicated financial scheme that linked Kelly to Shane's violent behavior. Had Aisling been the pawn in a much larger game? Was she simply being used to cover up a deeper conspiracy? The questions piled up as the walls of her family's secrets began to close in. Aisling couldn't escape the truth now, not any longer, as much as she wanted to. She couldn't pretend that the shooting had been an isolated incident. The forces that had pushed her into that moment were far more complex than she had ever imagined. The deeper Aisling dug into the truth behind Shane's death, the more her world began to fracture. She couldn't escape the feeling that she had been swept up in something far larger than she had ever realized. As her mind grappled with the details of the night, she pulled the trigger. She couldn't help but question everything. Was she really just trying to protect her mother, or was she being manipulated all along? The police, meanwhile, were growing more suspicious of Kelly's role in the entire ordeal. A few days after Aisling's interrogation, they obtained records of a life insurance policy that had been signed just months before Shane's death. The policy wasn't new. It had existed for years, but recent changes made Kelly the sole beneficiary, a fact that hadn't been shared with Aisling or anyone else in the family. There was more. The sum of the policy was staggeringly large. Too large, in fact, to ignore. Aisling found herself sitting in her mother's living room one evening, her mind racing as she thought about the file the police had shown her. It was almost surreal, as though someone had scripted the whole thing. Kelly had been hiding something, and Aisling wasn't sure how to feel. Betrayed? Or simply naive for not seeing it sooner? Her mother sat across from her, the tension thick between them. Kelly was trying to maintain her usual calm composure, but Aisling could see the cracks forming in her armor. The guilt was there, lurking beneath her mother's eyes, but so was a defiance. "You know, don't you?" Aisling's voice trembled, but she couldn't hold back the question any longer. Kelly didn't answer immediately. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers twisting a napkin she had been absent-mindedly folding. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kelly replied, her voice too flat, too rehearsed. Aisling slammed the file onto the coffee table in front of her. This life insurance policy you took out on Shane, and you were the sole beneficiary. How could you not have told me about this? You could have let Shane die for money?" Kelly flinched, and for a split second, Aisling saw her mother's carefully constructed mask crack. But then, just as quickly, she collected herself, folding her hands in her lap. "Shane had been threatening me," Kelly began, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it that Aisling hadn't heard before. "He was threatening all of us, Ash. You don't understand. He was out of control. He wanted more than just the house. He wanted everything. And if I didn't give him what he wanted, he would have ruined us all. I did what I had to do." Aisling recoiled, her heart sinking as the pieces of the puzzle started to shift. Her mother had never shared these details with her before. Had Shane truly been that dangerous? Or was Kelly simply trying to cover her tracks? The air in the room thickened as Kelly's voice grew softer. "You don't know the things he did. Aisling, the things he forced me to do. You don't know what he was capable of. He could have ruined everything we had, everything you had." Aisling shook her head, disbelief overtaking her. "And you think this was the answer? Killing him? You used me, didn't you?" Kelly's eyes darkened. "No, I didn't use you. I wanted to protect you. You're my daughter. You're all I have left." But the weight of her mother's words was too much. Aisling couldn't reconcile the woman she had always known with the woman who sat in front of her now. Kelly was admitting to manipulating the situation, and in doing so, she had dragged Aisling into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The truth was becoming clearer with every conversation, every revelation. The lines between right and wrong were blurring, and Aisling felt herself slipping further into a dark world of deception and betrayal. She needed answers, not just about Shane, but about her mother, her family, and the life she had believed to be so simple and safe. Just when Aisling thought she had uncovered all there was to know about her mother's role in Shane's death, a new twist came to light. It was late one evening when the detective handling Shane's case, Detective Walker, called Aisling with an unexpected discovery. "Aisling, we need to meet," he said urgently, his voice low and tense. "I think you need to see something. It's about your uncle." Aisling's pulse quickened. She had been expecting more questions, more accusations, but not this. She agreed to meet him at the station as soon as she could. When she arrived, the detective ushered her into a small room, his face grim. He handed her a thick file, one she hadn't seen before. Aisling took it reluctantly, her heart racing as she flipped it open. The contents of the file were like a punch to the gut. There in black and white were bank statements, loan records, and correspondence that detailed Shane's involvement in several illegal business ventures. But the most shocking revelation came from a set of records detailing a secret deal Shane had made with a local criminal organization. Shane had been laundering money, funding illegal operations, and using his position in the family to hide it all. It wasn't just about power and money. It was about survival in a world that threatened to consume him. Aisling sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This was a side of Shane she had never known, a side her mother had either deliberately ignored or didn't want to see. The picture of the uncle she thought she understood, of the man who had barged into their home, demanding the family's wealth, was rapidly changing. He hadn't just been a bitter, angry man. He had been desperate, tangled in something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Detective Walker leaned forward, watching her closely. Aisling, you need to understand something. Your uncle was not just a threat to your family because of the will. He was a threat because of what he was involved in. He had enemies, dangerous people who would do anything to get what they wanted. Aisling felt the weight of his words settle over her. She had shot Shane, yes, but she hadn't fully understood why he had been so dangerous in the first place. And now, with this new information, the truth seemed even more complicated. Was Shane's death truly self-defense? Or had she been caught in the middle of a deadly game that had far more players than she ever knew? As the investigation deepened, Aisling found herself standing at the edge of a precipice, her once simple life now marred by the weight of secrets, lies, and betrayals. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how much she had never known about the people closest to her. The detective, Walker, was no longer just a professional observer in her life. He was now an ally in unraveling a larger, far-reaching conspiracy. And with each new revelation, the darkness grew deeper. As Aisling tried to reconcile the pieces of her shattered reality, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about Shane and about her mother. After receiving the disturbing file from Walker, Aisling couldn't shake the sense that something was still missing. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. The more she dug into Shane's criminal activities, the more it became apparent that he hadn't been working alone. The documents revealed that Shane had been collaborating with someone from within the family, someone who had been feeding him information, helping him cover his tracks. Aisling's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even just about power. Shane had been part of something much bigger. And now, that secret was threatening to consume everyone involved. She spent the next few days piecing together a timeline of events, pulling apart the phone records, the financial documents, and the testimonies of those who had been in close contact with Shane in the months leading up to his death. The closer she got to the truth, the more she began to suspect that her mother might not be the only one with blood on her hands. One evening, while going through some old emails Shane had sent to an unknown contact, Aisling's eyes froze on a particular name. It wasn't a name she had ever heard before, but the context was chilling. The email had referenced a meeting at the warehouse, and the name of the person Shane was communicating with was none other than RL. Aisling's mind spun as she searched through the files. RL could be anyone, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. Her mother had always referred to a family friend, someone who had been around since before Aisling was born, as RL. The name was short, familiar, but she couldn't place it in the context of Shane's situation. Her pulse quickened as she put two and two together. The family friend wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was deeply involved in everything. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Aisling reached out to the family friend under the guise of a casual phone call. The conversation started normally, with pleasantries and small talk, but Aisling's mind was racing. She needed answers. "I've been thinking about Shane a lot lately," Aisling said, trying to sound casual. "It's still hard to wrap my head around what happened. It doesn't feel like it was just an accident." There was a pause on the other end of the line before RL responded, her voice cool and measured. "Well, darling, it's never easy, is it? People in our family, they have a way of keeping secrets. And sometimes those secrets come back to bite us." Aisling's heart skipped a beat. That wasn't a normal response. It was as if RL knew more than she was letting on. As the conversation went on, Aisling could hear subtle hints that RL knew things about Shane, things no one else knew, and Aisling's growing suspicion slowly began to crystallize into a terrifying truth. RL was involved in the darker side of Shane's dealings. It wasn't just the money laundering or the criminal enterprise. It was the control, the manipulation, and the ruthlessness. And Aisling now realized that her own mother might not have been the mastermind after all. It was RL who had orchestrated everything from the shadows. The weight of the truth hit Aisling like a ton of bricks. The walls that had once felt so safe were now crumbling around her. She needed to confront RL, but she had to do it carefully. If RL was truly the puppet master behind Shane's actions, she was more dangerous than Aisling could have ever imagined. With no clear path forward, Aisling did what she knew best. She began to observe. She attended family gatherings under the pretense of normalcy, watching RL carefully, searching for any sign of guilt or nervousness. But RL was a master of deception, never once giving anything away. It was like she was 2 steps ahead, always anticipating Aisling's every move. Days passed, and Aisling's frustration grew. She could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating her every move. But she couldn't let it go. Not now. Not when everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down. Finally, one evening, Aisling confronted RL at a private dinner party, her mind racing with every step she took. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared herself for the ultimate confrontation. "Why didn't you tell me?" Aisling's voice was low, laced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why didn't you warn me? You knew what Shane was involved in. You knew what was happening to our family." RL smiled softly, as though the conversation was a game, one she had been playing for years. "You don't understand, do you?" she said, her tone almost sympathetic. "It wasn't about warning you. It was about protecting you. This family is fragile, Aisling, and sometimes to keep the balance, sacrifices need to be made." Aisling recoiled, horrified by the cold, calculating tone. "Sacrifices? You manipulated all of us for what? For control? For money?" RL's smile never faltered. "Control? Maybe. But money? That's always secondary. What you're too blind to see is that it's all about power. You, your mother, Shane, you are all pawns in a much larger game, and you're still playing it." Aisling's blood ran cold. The words hit her like a physical blow. "You don't even care about any of us, do you?" "No, Aisling," RL said softly, her eyes gleaming with something far darker than Aisling had ever seen. "I care about the future, and I always get what I want." Aisling's world had crumbled completely. She was surrounded by shadows, with no one to trust. Her mother, once the foundation of her life, was now a stranger, a woman whose motives were as dark as the lies she had been told. RL had been pulling the strings all along, and Aisling was just another victim of the games being played by the people closest to her. But one thing Aisling knew now: she had to break free. The only way to escape was to cut herself off completely from the web of lies, from the people who had held her captive in a prison of manipulation. With Detective Walker's help, Aisling made plans to disappear. She knew the risks. She would be leaving behind everything, including her family. But there was no other way. If she stayed, she would be swallowed whole by the darkness. As the days passed, Aisling prepared herself for the hardest decision of her life. To walk away, to leave behind everything she had ever known, and to start over. But as she packed her things, she couldn't help but wonder, could she ever truly escape? Or was the darkness of her family's past bound to follow her, no matter how far she ran?